The Japanese naval officers had been told that America was a nation of jazz musicians and factory workers, soft from luxury, incapable of the sustained sacrifice that war demanded. They had studied the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, counted every capital ship, calculated the years it would take to replace them: 4 years for a battleship, 2 for a fleet carrier, perhaps 18 months for a cruiser if the Americans pushed their shipyards to exhaustion. But here, in the intercepted radio traffic of late 1943, the numbers made no sense. The carriers kept multiplying like phantom ships, appearing in battle reports from waters where no carriers should exist, bearing names that weren't in any registry, flying aircraft from decks that according to all logic should not yet have been laid down. Admiral Fukudome Shigeru sat in the humid operations room beneath Tokyo, sweat beading on his forehead despite the November chill above ground, staring at a chart that showed American carrier positions across the Pacific. 6 months ago, there had been gaps in the chart, vast stretches of ocean where the Imperial Navy could move unobserved. Now, the gaps were closing. The pins on the map bred overnight like insects. His aide had just confirmed the sighting of USS Liscum Bay off Macon Atoll, a carrier that, according to their intelligence, had been a cargo ship named Steel Advocate just 4 months prior. 4 months. The teak wood of the table felt suddenly insubstantial beneath his hands, as if the solid world he had known was dissolving into something uncomfortably fluid. The Americans called them CVE's escort carriers, but the Japanese naval staff had begun referring to them with a mixture of disdain and creeping fear as shitty V's or Kaiser coffins, translating the dark humor of American sailors who served on these vessels. Yet the mockery rang hollow. These weren't the fleet carriers of Midway, those magnificent beasts that took years to build and perfect. These were something else entirely: cargo ships transformed into aircraft carriers in weeks, welded together by women and teenagers in shipyards that hadn't existed a year before. The very concept violated everything the Japanese naval architects understood about shipbuilding. A carrier was a temple of engineering, requiring master craftsmen and years of careful construction. The flight deck alone demanded precisely calculated mathematics. The hangar spaces needed perfect ventilation systems. The fuel bunkers required elaborate safety mechanisms. These were not ships one simply assembled like rice barrels. But the Americans were doing exactly that. In shipyards along their western coast, Richmond, Vancouver, Portland, they had created something that defied comprehension. The intelligence reports, when they managed to obtain them through neutral sources, described scenes that seemed like Western propaganda. A ship's hull taking shape in 4 days. The same hull launching 24 days after its keel was laid. The morning shift workers arriving to find entire sections that hadn't existed when they'd left the previous evening, as if the ships truly were building themselves in the darkness. The reports mentioned something called prefabrication. Entire sections of ships built miles inland, transported on railroads, and welded together like a child's model kit scaled to impossible size. Captain Ishikawa Shingo had laughed when he first heard these reports in early 1943. He had trained at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, where master shipbuilders spent months on a single gun turret, where the rivets in a destroyer's hull were placed with the precision of calligraphy. His mind could not reconcile the patient craftsmanship he had witnessed old men who had built ships for the emperor's father teaching young apprentices to read the grain of steel like poetry with these American fantasies of ships, assembled in weeks by housewives who had never seen the dark ocean. The laughter had curdled in his throat 6 months later when the Battle of the Philippine Sea began and American carriers appeared like spring flowers, each launching strikes from positions where no carrier should be, each bearing aircraft that overwhelmed the carefully husbanded Japanese squadrons. The rain drummed against the windows of the Naval General Staff headquarters as winter settled over Tokyo in 1943. Inside, the air tasted of stale cigarette smoke and that peculiar mixture of floor wax and fear sweat that had begun to permeate every military building. Admiral Fukudome stood before a new chart, this one showing not current positions but projected American strength. His aide had extrapolated from confirmed sightings and the fragmentary intelligence they could gather. If the Americans could truly produce a carrier every week, not a fleet carrier perhaps, but something that could launch 30 aircraft, something that could project power across 1,000 miles of ocean, then by summer of 1944, they would have more carriers than Japan had destroyers. The mathematics of it created a kind of vertigo. It was not simply that America could replace its losses faster than Japan could inflict them. It was that America seemed to be playing a different game entirely, one where the traditional constraints of time, materials, and human limitation simply didn't apply. The Japanese strategy had assumed that spiritual superiority and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. They had calculated that a Japanese pilot, trained for years, infused with the warrior spirit of his ancestors, was worth 3 or 4 American pilots. Perhaps this was still true, but what if each American pilot was backed by 10 aircraft? What if every carrier sunk was replaced by 3 more before the victory celebration had ended? Lieutenant Commander Yamaguchi had served on the carrier Shokaku, had felt the entire ship shudder when American bombs found their mark at Coral Sea. He knew intimately the thousands of hours of labor required to repair battle damage, the skilled welders working in shifts around the clock, the specialized steel that had to be manufactured to exact specifications, the delicate balance of the flight deck that could be ruined by improper repairs. When Shokaku had limped back to Yokosuka, it had taken 3 months to make her battle-worthy again, and that was with Japan's finest technicians working themselves to exhaustion. Yet the Americans were producing entirely new carriers in less time than it took Japan to patch holes in existing ones. The cherry blossoms bloomed early in 1944, their pale pink petals drifting past the windows like snow, but inside the staff rooms, winter had settled permanently in the officers' hearts. Each morning brought new confirmations of American carriers: USS Anzio, USS Corregidor, USS Coral Sea, the names themselves a mockery, commemorating American defeats that were being transformed into the instruments of victory. The Japanese officers had been taught that naming required ritual significance, that a ship's name carried the spirit of what it represented. The carrier Zuikaku meant auspicious crane, a prayer for good fortune carefully chosen after consultation with Shinto priests. But the Americans were naming their carriers like they were numbering street addresses, pulling names from a hat, slapping them on ships that rolled off the production line like automobiles. In the Philippines, Vice Admiral Ozawa Gisaburo prepared for what everyone knew was coming. He had 29 aircraft among his entire carrier force, 29 planes to face an American fleet that reconnaissance estimated at 15 carriers. Perhaps more. The scouts had stopped counting after running out of designation codes. The morning before the battle, he had walked the flight deck of Zuikaku, his flagship, running his hand along the wooden planking that master craftsmen had laid with the precision of a temple floor. He could feel every joint, every carefully fitted plank, the accumulated skill of centuries of Japanese woodworking adapted to the modern age. The ship herself was a work of art, a synthesis of tradition and technology that represented everything Japan had achieved. The American carriers, by contrast, were industrial products, stamped out like mess kits. Their flight decks were straight steel, welded by teenage girls who had learned their trade in weeks. They leaked oil, their engines broke down, their elevators jammed. American sailors wrote home complaining about the thin hulls, the way you could hear conversations through the bulkheads, the constant smell of fresh paint barely covering the rust. They were ugly ships, graceless, purely functional, but they existed. That was their terrible power, not their elegance or craftsmanship, but their simple, overwhelming existence. Commander Suzuki had been captured after his destroyer was sunk off Saipan. In the American prisoner compound, he had met a Seabee, one of the construction battalion sailors, who had worked at the Kaiser shipyards before joining the Navy. The man had described, with obvious pride, something called the Liberty Ship recipe, a formula so precise that any shipyard could follow it like a cookbook. Pre-cut steel plates numbered and labeled, welding patterns marked in white paint, components manufactured in Iowa or Ohio, shipped by rail, assembled by workers who couldn't pronounce the names of the seas these ships would sail. The Sable had claimed they were now building the ships faster than the crews could be trained to sail them, that carriers were sitting idle in San Francisco Bay, waiting for enough men to learn the difference between port and starboard. This was the horror that crept into Japanese strategic thinking, not the American bombs or torpedoes or even their seemingly endless supply of aircraft, but the revelation that war itself had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The Japanese had prepared for a war of warriors, where courage and skill and sacrifice would determine victory. They had found themselves instead in a war of factories, where victory went to whoever could produce the most steel, pour the most concrete, train the most welders. It was as if they had shown up to a duel with the finest samurai sword ever forged, only to discover their opponent had brought a factory that produced 1,000 crude but functional guns every day. The intelligence reports grew more surreal as 1,944 progressed. A new class of carrier, the commencement bay type, even more simplified than the previous models. Ships being built inland, in cornfields, floated down rivers to the sea. The same shipyard that took Japan 6 months to build, now producing a carrier every 14 days. 14 days! Lieutenant Tanaka, reading this report, had done the calculation at that rate. A single American shipyard could produce more carriers in a year than Japan had built in its entire naval history. The mathematics of defeat became inescapable, as fixed and certain as the tide tables. By late 1944, Japanese naval planning had taken on the quality of a fever dream. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of physics and time. Staff officers would plan operations against known American carrier groups, only to discover by the time the plan was ready that the enemy force had doubled in size. They were like men trying to bail out the ocean with buckets while somewhere beyond the horizon, invisible factories poured in more water than 1,000 men could remove. The phrase, Kansen-Kessen, the decisive battle that had once rung through the corridors of naval headquarters like a prayer, now sounded hollow, almost quaint. How could there be a decisive battle when the enemy could lose a dozen carriers and replace them before the season changed? Admiral Toyota Somu, commander of the combined fleet, had stood on a hill overlooking Yokosuka Naval Base in January 1945. Below him, the once mighty shipyard was nearly silent. There was no steel for new construction, no fuel to move what ships remained. He could see the carrier Amagi, camouflaged with pine branches and fishnets, trying to hide from American aircraft that came daily now, flying from carriers that patrolled just beyond the horizon like wolves. He remembered visiting the Kaiser shipyards before the war, as part of a naval delegation in 1935. The Americans had shown them around with typical boastfulness, pointing out their advanced techniques, their mass production methods. The Japanese officers had smiled politely and taken notes, privately contemptuous of American crudeness, their reduction of shipbuilding to mere industrial process. Now, standing in the bitter wind, watching his remaining carriers hide like rabbits, he understood that they had seen the future and dismissed it. They had mistaken efficiency for lack of artistry, speed for carelessness, standardization for mediocrity. The Americans hadn't built better carriers, they had built a system that built carriers, a meta-construction that was the true weapon. The ships themselves were almost incidental, just the visible manifestation of something larger and more terrible, an entire nation that had transformed itself into a single vast machine dedicated to the production of war materials. In the prisoner of war camps after the surrender, Japanese naval officers would gather in the evenings, still trying to understand what had happened. Captain Omai Toshikazu, who had served on the Naval General Staff, would later write that the most psychologically devastating moment of the war wasn't the atomic bombs or even the loss of the fleet, but the gradual realization that they had been fighting something that wasn't really there, not a fleet of carriers but a process, not ships but a system, not an enemy that could be defeated in battle, but an industrial metabolism that converted raw materials into aircraft carriers with the same relentless certainty that seasons changed or tides rose and fell. The American guards at the camps would sometimes share magazines from home, and the Japanese officers would stare at advertisements for automobiles and refrigerators, understanding finally that the same assembly lines that had produced their defeat were already being converted back to consumer goods, as if the greatest naval construction program in human history had been merely a temporary interruption in America's real business of mass production. The Escort's carriers, those impossible ships that had seemed to build themselves, were already being scrapped or converted to cargo vessels, their brief, violent purpose served, their steel recycled into the suburban dream of post-war America. Years later, Admiral Fukudome would write in his memoirs about a conversation with an American naval historian who had asked him when he knew the war was lost. He had thought for a long moment before answering that it was when he realized the Americans were building carriers faster than Japan could train pilots, when he understood that his enemy wasn't fighting the same war, wasn't even operating in the same conceptual universe. The historian had nodded and mentioned, almost offhandedly, that by the end of the war, America had canceled contracts for 45 additional escort carriers because they simply didn't need them anymore. 45 carriers canceled as casually as one might cancel a restaurant reservation. The cherry blossoms still bloom each spring at Yokosuka, where once the Imperial Navy's proud carriers were built with patience and precision and prayers for victory. Tourists come now, taking photographs, most unaware that beneath their feet lie the foundations of dry docks where master craftsmen once spent years building single ships. Across the Pacific, in Richmond, California, the Kaiser shipyards are gone, replaced by housing developments and shopping centers. A small plaque marks the spot where Liberty ships and escort carriers once emerged at impossible speeds, where Rosie the Riveter and her sisters accomplished what Japanese admirals had deemed physically impossible. But for those Japanese officers who lived through it, who watched their carefully calculated strategies dissolved by American industrial might, the memory remained like a scar. They had prepared for a war of quality against quantity, never imagining that their enemy could achieve both, never dreaming that ships could essentially build themselves through systematized production, never understanding until too late that they were fighting not just a nation but an idea. The idea that any problem, even war itself, could be solved through proper organization and sufficient production capacity. The escort carriers hadn't simply defeated the Imperial Navy, they had revealed a new kind of warfare, where victory went not to the brave or the skilled, but to whoever could most efficiently convert iron ore into flight decks. It was not the atomic bombs that had truly ended the Japanese Empire, some would later reflect, but those impossible aircraft carriers that had seemed to spontaneously generate from American shipyards, multiplying beyond counting, beyond reason, beyond any strategy's ability to counter. They were the physical manifestation of a kind of power that Japan, for all its warrior tradition and spiritual strength, had never imagined could exist the power to transform the fundamental equations of warfare through sheer industrial multiplication. To build victory, not through superior strategy or courage, but through the relentless arithmetic of mass production. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.